But yeah, you weren't reading.
All right, it's 2:45, so let's get back started again. We are continuing to talk about aggression, so today is going to be all about aggression. And if we sort of take a step back, there's really three main reasons that we would associate testosterone, sort of lines of general evidence for reasons why we would associate testosterone with aggression. So, I mean, what are three reasons why you might think testosterone is involved in aggression? There's a sex difference, right, with males both having higher aggression and higher androgens. Is that what that's the one you were going to go with? Okay. Okay, so aggression and, right, so there's a temporal variation in aggression that also coincides with a temporal variation in androgens. So during the breeding season, androgens are high, aggression is high. And there's one other one that's important. Puberty, right? So notice that we go from a very non-aggressive sort of play kind of state to aggression. And when you sort of go from juvenile to adult, you have a large increase in aggression. Yeah?
I have here on my notes covariance, but I don't know what that is.
Okay, so this is the mating season one, right? So what we mean is a sort of temporal covariance, right? So during the mating season, aggression goes up and androgens go up, right? When you are not in the mating season, androgens go down and aggression goes down. This is actually the you can't have a kind of better example of covariation than this, right? So the red line is testosterone and the green line is aggression, right? So those two things go roughly together, right? So I mean, they're essentially like right on top of each other the entire time. And this was kind of our first example here, right? So aggression, seasonality. All right. So, and again, it's a great segue into this discussion. So red deer have this covariation that we see, and we can manipulate them, and their the relationship between social rank and the various manipulations that we look at, you know. So if we chop their antlers off, obviously, considering they use those to achieve social status, that their social status is going to plummet. but we can add testosterone in the summer and sort of make them a social climber, right? Again, notice this is before the mating season. Winter is essentially after the mating season, so we can keep them more aggressive and preventing them from shedding their antlers. And if we castrate them in the winter, obviously their social rank will take a hit as well. And so this kind of leads us, and this is something that we're going to kind of come back to over the course of today's discussion, is this idea of the relationship between social status and androgens. Okay? Now, hopefully we've gotten through the fact that, really your social status is determined by submissive behavior, like i.e. who you are submissive to, rather than aggression per se. But if you are aggressive, generally speaking, are you likely to be of higher or lower social status? Higher, right? So there is this promotion of aggression, which can lead to changes in social status, right? Now, if it's just in the breeding season, that's one thing, but status is kind of an interesting phenomenon, okay? And, right, so there are many different statuses that you can have, and those can be modified by androgens. Now, one of my favorite things that used to be in the book, and they took out of the book, but I just love this story so much that I can't get rid of it. I don't know why they took it out, but this is the story of the Harris sparrow. Okay, now this is a sort of our first discussion of really what we would think of as hierarchies, right? Now we've talked a little bit about a hierarchy before, and so generally speaking, why do animals form hierarchies? Right, so there's less aggression, right? So another way to sort of think about this is the cost of any social interaction in a hierarchy goes down, right? So if everybody is sort of equal, in a sense, right? If everyone has equal status, every interaction is fraught with friction, right? Because if two individuals are of the same social status and they want the same limited resource, there's going to be conflict, because that conflict is not, in a sense, pre-resolved by status. If you have higher status than I do, and we both want the same thing, you get preferential access, right? If I'm of higher status and there's an individual of lower status, I get access, right? The conflict is resolved before it takes place. And so if you look at aggression as a sort of form of conflict resolution, status is essentially pre-resolved conflict, okay? Now, this is the sort of thought process, and again, you don't necessarily have to think of hierarchies this way. I just would like just try it on and see how if it makes sense to you. And I think this kind of precursor is useful for understanding the Harris sparrow. So we have to know a little bit about the ecology of the Harris sparrow for this to make sense. They form small breeding groups, right? So we say a small breeding group, this might be between 10 and 20 individuals, right? Sort of a local group. Now, this is during the breeding season, as I said, but when you are not in the breeding season, all of the Harris sparrows, right, thousands of them, converge on these mixed sex feeding areas, right? So essentially, when it's the non-breeding season, they're all together, they're feeding, they're growing, and then once the breeding season comes, they make a migration, they go back to their local territories, and they sort of settle out into these local groups, right? Now, in those local groups, with the 10 to 20 individuals, they have a very nice linear hierarchy, right? And this is the way humans do it too, right? So in your small local group, you know everybody, everybody knows you, status is well established in your local group. But if you were to then take your local group of 10 or 20 down, and now you've got thousands, how do you assign status? Right now, so if everybody's in this feeding environment, how can you reduce again, how can you reduce the number of conflicts? Right? This is our goal. Because if nobody has any, because can any individual know 1,000 other individuals? No, right? You can't really have a status based on individual recognition and knowledge on the scale of thousands. I think it's like 120. There's some number in humans of like the maximum sort of tribe size that you can have where you can still know everybody. And it's essentially the same for birds. So they have a very unique system of how they assign status. Your local status translates into your winter molt, right? So at the end of the breeding season, you're going to shed all of your feathers and you're going to grow your new feathers back for the trip down south, right? That makes sense? And so the higher your status in your local group, the darker your feathers are going to be. Okay? So, let's just think about this again. If you are the alpha of your local little group, you're going to have the darkest feathers in your group. The lowest ranking individual is going to be mostly white, right? So the blacker, and as we'll see what this looks like, the blacker you are, the more dominant you are. This making sense, everybody?
Is that from testosterone?
Well, so interestingly, there's a relationship between social dominance and testosterone in the breeding season. Remember, so we just talked about that covariance. So your status during the breeding season, so during the breeding season, do you have testosterone or not? Yes, right? What about in the non-breeding season? No. So, yes, testosterone has an effect on establishing your status in your local group, but when you're in this sort of mixed sex wintering feeding zone, you don't have any testosterone. Okay? But you do have your feathers. Right? Make sense, everybody? Okay, so if you've got the dark feathers, you're dominant, right? And so how do resources get partitioned in the breeding season or in the non-breeding season? What happens? If I want a seed and you want a seed, how do we figure out who gets it? The darker birds always, right? If I'm coming up and there's a lighter bird, well then, I'm gonna. Now, the question you might ask yourself is, how do you know how dark you are?
And that's what I was asking about the testosterone, like what allows them to know?
So here's the interesting part. If you were the alpha in your local group, do you know that?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yes, right? So you have some intrinsic sense of self. Now, the interesting part is that this translates into your essential perception of your own status. Right? Now, so what are we going to do to these birds? I mean, that seems particularly mean. I think maybe instead of pulling them out, we might just paint them darker in some cases and bleach them in some other cases, right? So we're going to mess with their feather coloration, because what are we interested in learning by what will we learn by darkening the feathers of some light birds or darkening the feathers or lightening the feathers of some dominant birds? What are we gonna learn here? If it's a visual cue, but also the relationship between the visual cue, i.e., you all played that game where you have to put the card and you don't know what you have, but you know what everybody else has, right? It's kind of like that. In a sense, we're looking at two things, right? What is the self-perception of status, and how is that reflected in the interactions with you, right? Because you probably couldn't see how dark your feathers were in the first place, and now if we've lightened them or darkened them, we haven't changed you, but we've changed the way that you are perceived by everybody else. how do we think this is gonna go? So no one has any instincts about how this is gonna go?
It's gonna be the same.
It's gonna be the same, we got that?
They're gonna fight.
They're gonna fight, who's gonna fight?
Oh.
Fake pigmented ones.
The fake pigmented ones?
Yeah, and the real ones.
And the real ones, yeah, okay, so there's gonna be some conflict that's gonna arise. Alright, trying to think about this. I don't know if you guys, I don't know how it is here, but like when I was in college, there were pickup basketball courts, right? There was like court 1, court 2, court 3, court 4, right? And those courts roughly aligned to how good at basketball you were, right? So if you took someone from court 4, which is, you know, where the amateurs are playing, and you put them on court 1, how long do you think it would take for all the other players on court 1 to figure out that that person didn't belong? Not very long. So I think that's kind of one model. I think the sort of martial arts model is good, right? So you can have your rank is by the color of the belt, and you can change the color, but it's pretty obvious pretty quickly, right? If you're in the wrong place. Now, the interesting part here is, as I said, what we're going to do is we're going to bleach some birds and we're going to darken other birds. Now, the interesting thing here is that, as you noted, neither group is going to do very well. Right? What are the bleached birds going to be doing all the time? They're going to be fighting all the time. Now, why are those fights going to be escalated? Because the other animals are like, I'm not submitting to this light-colored bird. Are you kidding me? All the other birds are going to make fun of me. Right? And what are the dark birds going to experience? They're going to be kicked out of the area with all the other dark-colored birds because it's obvious, right? Because here's the thing. Notice that even though you have an overt signal of status, there's also something about status which is sort of walking the walk as well. Right? Exactly. It changes the behavior, especially of the bleached birds, because notice that the bleached bird thinks that it's still a dark bird. And it's going up to these birds that it considers of lower status, and they're not backing away. So they're getting in fights constantly. Right? And then, talk about imposter syndrome. You know, now some birds running away from you, like, oh, all right, this is nice. But pretty soon, all of the other dark birds are going to be like, no, we know you're not supposed to be here. And so there's only one manipulation that made this work, which was to take the darkened birds. So instead of just darkening them, we're going to darken them and give them androgens in the non-breeding season. So now we have a bird we painted their feathers, but we've also given them androgen when no other bird has androgens. So then we can actually get them to be the status that their feathers reflect. But again, I think one of the kind of key ideas, I really find this story very interesting because status is not something that can be faked easily. Right? That's why when we think about female mate choice, females choose dominant males because dominance is a very difficult thing to fake. Even if you're painted to look dominant, as soon as you get around other dominant birds or dominant individuals, it's revealed pretty quickly that you're not of that status. So this can, again, be essentially mediated a little bit by adding testosterone. So if we darken the birds and give them testosterone, they are going to dramatically increase their social status. Prediction time. What would happen if we took a light-colored bird and gave it testosterone? Is it going to increase dramatically in its social status? No, what's going to happen? It's just going to be getting in fights all the time, right? But the other birds are not going to do what? They're not going to submit. And you can see the sort of interaction between the signal and the actual behavior is really important. So, I might have given you the impression that certainly more androgens is good for status. And there is a sense that that's true, but if that were true, why would we have breeding season fluctuations of androgens? There must be some cost of androgens. Now we might say it's just fighting all the time. But notice that in the hair sparrows, we don't really need the androgens to have this thing settled, right? But my point here is that androgens change behavior, but that is not always a good thing, right? So when we see increases in androgen sometimes and decreases other times, we can assume that there's some ecological reason for this to be the case. And one of the ways that we can investigate what this purpose of low androgens is by taking animals in the non-breeding season, or the time when they have low androgens, and give them androgens and see what they do instead. Now, if we are looking here at our jeweled lizards, in the non-breeding season, what should you be doing? Eating. What should you not be doing? Probably fighting with other males or looking for females. Now, why should you be eating? What are you preparing for? The next season. So, what we're going to do is take our jeweled lizards, we are going to implant them with testosterone, and we're going to compare their behavior to jeweled lizards that have just a cholesterol implant. Right? These are what we would call controls. So, what happened to our T-implanted animals? Well, it's hard to know, but they weren't eating very much. We know that. Right? So, likely they were starting fights, chasing females, doing things that were not productive for the next breeding season. Because again, remember, animals are growing in the non-breeding season not just for survival, but because that will make them better able to compete against other males for females in the future. And so if they have excess testosterone, they aren't doing the things that are positively associated with next season. They are still sort of essentially trying to stay in the current season. And this kind of gives us a pretty critical idea that there is an optimum amount of testosterone. So you don't want too little testosterone, or you're likely to be of low status, but you also don't want too much testosterone, right? Because that can lead to things like compromised immune function, as well as compromised survival and longevity, right? So you want this sort of average level of testosterone. Not too much, not too little. Okay. Now, this is a very important figure. You want to highlight this figure, and I'm going to tell you right now, this is difficult to understand. But the message is actually really important, both from the context of understanding puberty, but also kind of writ large in our society. Now, hopefully, as we go through what's going on here, we'll be able to kind of unpack that. So, what we're really interested in here, okay? What we're really interested in is whether or not going through puberty as a male affects your behavior permanently. Okay? Now, again, we know that androgens are going to have an effect, right? We know they do lots of things, especially with male reproductive behavior. But what we're really looking at here is, does going through puberty as a male affect your behavior for the rest of your life? All right? Now, let's unpack how they went about trying to answer this question. So, what behaviors are we measuring here? Attacks and escapes. Another way, so if we can extract that, what are we measuring? Aggression and submission, right? That's what we're measuring. We are measuring aggression, right, through quantifying the number of attacks, and submission through measuring the number of escape attempts that the animal makes in an encounter, right? So we're interested in whether or not, and again, as I said, we're interested in whether or not going through puberty as a male affects your agonistic behavior. So again, this is essentially what amounts to like a 2x2 design. So we have two separate treatments, right? Where we have castration pre-pubertal, and then we have castration post-pubertal as an adult. All right, so. If this is birth, this is puberty. I'm using puberty, but we would normally call this sexual maturation, but I think we kind of understand that. We can also call this activation, all right? So, puberty. Okay, so this is going to be our pre-pubertal castration. So what we're going to do is GDX here. And again, this is a timeline, right? So if we GDX, are they going to go through puberty? No, right? But this is essentially the landmark age, right? So here, in the second one, we're going to GDX here. What changes is when we do this relative to puberty. Okay? Then, half of our animals at the time of test. Notice that these animals, this is part of the tough part, these animals are all the same age when they're tested. Okay, they're not different ages, they're all the same age. And then group A is going to be given testosterone, or they get cholesterol or placebo, and this as well. Yes?
So when it says adulthood, it basically is the same as post.
Yes, so what it means is castrated in adulthood.
Okay.
Right? That's why it's important. Great question. It means so after puberty, so this would be called juvenile or prepubertal. This would be called adulthood.
Okay. Got it.
Right? Like maybe write that off, but we're good. Okay, so they're all tested at the same age, and they're tested and they're given either testosterone or placebo, which is always cholesterol in this case, right? The placebo for testosterone is always cholesterol. All right. Now, what happened? There's 0 escapes as an adult. So, again, this is a resident intruder paradigm. So basically, the test animal is in its home cage, and we add another male. If you were castrated after puberty, castrated as an adult, what do? Attack. Always. Is whether you attack or not dependent on androgens at the time that the test takes place? No. Right? If you were castrated before puberty, what do when an intruder is added to your home? You run. Is that androgen dependent? Are you, well, let's say that, so there does appear to be a difference here, right? There does look like there's a difference. What is the androgen making you do? Be more submissive. If anything, more submissive. Now, notice that we did get a few attacks, but relatively small number. Okay? So, is whether you're biased to attack or flee dependent on circulating androgens at the time? I've got some nods and some firm no's. Okay. All right. So, is attacking dependent on androgens? No. Is submitting dependent on androgens? Really? Are you going to submit if you don't have androgens? Yeah. Right? Okay. What do we really want to know here? What is our essential question that we're asking? If your behavior is permanently changed by going through male puberty, right? That's the question we're asking. Is it?
Yes.
Yes. Is it, if I drop your androgens to 0 after you've had male puberty, does that change your behavior? No. What do we think this means? Why is this important? Puberty establishes a behavior which is essentially, right, so typically when we see these unalterable patterns, we see them, or we've seen these types of unalterable patterns. When have we seen a pattern that's kind of similar to this, where you have exposure to a hormone during a certain period of time, and then you have that forever? What's that called? What is that about? That's organization, right? So this is a permanent effect of activation. Can anybody think of any context that this might be relevant to humans? Why teenage boys are so aggressive? But we kind of knew that already. Because puberty is when you have a high amount of androgens and a high amount of aggression. That is also true, but that's not quite what I'm getting at. What are the criterion for a man to compete in a woman's sport? They can't have testosterone. Does it matter? Does it? Okay, so I asked a question, right? So this is, and again, I'm not going to say that there's an answer to this. We have some data from animals that ask the question, is there a permanent change that results from experiencing male puberty? Right?
Yeah.
Now, we asked, what is the criterion for a biological man to compete in women's sports?
He has testosterone, which makes his muscles, make him perform better.
The criterion for competing in, even at the Olympic level in some sports, right, it varies by sport, is what is being measured is the amount of androgens you have at time of test. Right? You have to have low androgens, or even sometimes zero depending, right? That's usually some amount that you have to have, right? It's below some threshold. But does that affect your behavior? Is there going to be a difference between those two individuals?
Yes.
How can we say confidently that that's the case? Because this is the kind of data that we use to say, okay, what has happened here? This individual experience, right? Then there's a massive difference in the behavior, right? That is unalterable by androgens. So notice that the red animal placebo in the adulthood category has the highest amount of aggression of any animal on this chart. How much androgen does that animal have? 0. Right? And so I'm not taking a side on what this should be, but notice that the data that we look at has effects on questions that are, as I would say, that's a pretty hotly contested question. Yeah.
So the bottom panel is before GDX, before puberty.
Which one? So so you mean this here, this whole thing?
Oh, no, so like the left is if they were GDX before puberty.
Yes.
Okay, I got
Yeah. So this is submission on the top. It's aggression on, or I'm kidding. It's submission on the bottom, aggression on the top.
that. Okay, the left and right was this.
GDX before puberty, GDX after puberty. All of the animals that took part in the test are GDX. It's just whether or not they experienced puberty as a male. Right? Now, again, this is, like I said, this is an issue. Hormones and who should compete against who is a very hot topic, right, in the world right now, right? The Olympics are still fighting over it, and the Olympics are starting in like 3 months, right? Yes?
I'm still not getting it. You said left and right. So these are not two separate panels, based on the question she just asked. So she asked about the bottom panel and you were like,
So we're measuring two different things,
right.
right? So we're measuring aggression on, so the top is the number of attacks, right? That's just for measuring aggression. And on the bottom panel, we're just measuring submission. The left, these bars are animals that were castrated before they went to male puberty. These animals were castrated after.
But that is for the top and bottom, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So these animals are submissive and not aggressive, pretty much regardless of androgen status. And these animals are aggressive and not submissive, regardless of androgen status. That make sense? Like I said, it is kind of tricky, right? Because of this, right? Pubertal versus adult, right? It's important to know that they are all GDX'd, right? The only hormones they have, or the only androgens they have, are administered by the scientists, right? They're all castrated at time of test, right? But what it shows, and I think why this is kind of important, is that it shows that these animals and the circuits controlling aggression are permanently changed by androgens during that critical window of time, right? Now, that's not saying who should or shouldn't be allowed to compete against each other, but it is a piece of data that we should, I think, allow to inform. Our goal is to always bring to bear data on any kind of question like this, right? Okay, so depending on the species, right, you're not always associated with aggression, but typically you have a lot of hormone changes during puberty, right? You know, have lots of LH, FSH, we secrete androgens, plasma, androgens increase, intermale aggression goes up, all sorts of aggression goes up, and we see in many species the time of puberty. Post-puberty, most males will actually disperse, or a lot of males will actually disperse from their home groups, right? So they can essentially go out and mate. If we look at aggression over time, these are hamsters, and what we see is that their types of interactions sort of change over the course of development. And so these are kind of resident intruder paradigms. So again, we have a home cage with an animal in it. That's the animal we're interested in, that's the animal we're watching. We put a new individual of the same sex and we see how they attack, right? Notice that early on, close to the time of puberty, right, we have a lot of attacks. And these attacks actually change in the type of attack, right? As you can kind of see, I don't know if you can kind of see, it's kind of a tough angle, but the hamsters are actually taking very different tactics, right? So these tactics become sort of escalated as they get older, right? They sort of kind of stand up at each other to start with, and then they start biting, right? So B is a bite to the arms and sides. C, they're going right for the soft underbelly. And D, they're actually chasing and attacking from the rear, right? So this kind of changes over the course of development, and we see a peak in aggression, right, around the time of puberty, right? Okay, again, notice that we can see this is for males. This is organization, this is activation, this is steady state levels going forward. Right? Notice that the activation period, and again, it's more than just, as I think we hopefully have demonstrated, it's more than just androgens getting up to a certain level that are turning on aggression. It's actually, this is a critical window of time during which a male has to have higher levels of androgens, and then that permanently changes their behavior. And okay, moving there. All right. So, if we talk about sex differences, males have more circulating androgens. They have more exposure to androgens over the course of their lives. And generally speaking, males are encouraged to be aggressive, whereas females are generally discouraged from competing aggressively. And so if we kind of look at those kind of differences more directly, boys have more T, they were exposed to developmental T, they are, again, they are encouraged to be aggressive, and as with most things, this is very hard to address in humans, right? Now, why? Again, the obvious is you can't manipulate humans like you can do animals. If you want to know what the effect of loading up androgens on females, either during development or during puberty, you can just do that to an animal. But with humans, not many people are going to be signing up their kids to have these kinds of experiments done on them. So, if we look at the way that hormones are involved in aggression, right, we see there's quite a bit of variation here. I mean, that's the first thing I want to say, that there's quite a bit of variation, meaning that not every species does the same thing the same way. So, meaning that there are not like universal principles of the kind of way that this plays out. Now, one of the sort of general principles that we do see, and this is much more prominent in males, which is, and we've talked about this before, but we'll formalize our discussion. This is the winner and loser effect, right? We sort of began the class, right? If you remember, and it was on the first exam, the fans, right? So even if your team wins, you get an increase in androgens, and if your team loses, and if you're like, soccer fans are really, really partisan, these are not casual fans, right? You're gonna get a decrease in T. So generally for males, if you win a fight, you're going to get an increase in androgen, and if you lose a fight, you're going to get a decrease in androgen. The other effect here is temporal. The increase in androgen is short, where the decrease in androgen tends to be much longer. Okay? So winners get a spike in androgen that goes down quickly. Losers get a decrease in androgen that lasts for days to weeks. Right? Okay. So, if we kind of look at some of these, this data, this is again our resident intruder model. And if we can kind of compare these different categories. So, now again, what qualifies as a win in an encounter between animals? Submission. All right. I think we're getting the hang of this, right? Right. It is submission. Right? So, in a resident intruder encounter or in any kind of aggressive encounter, you get a win when the other animal submits. Now, if I want to bias, right? So let's say we're doing a random interaction. We've got a home cage, and we're going to throw an intruder in there, and I want to bet on the outcome, right? How do I make sure that my hamster wins? I can give it testosterone. I can train him. I can do a little montage like Rocky, train a little treadmill. That's true, possibly. But we can look at the data. What does my hamster, how could I best train my hamster? Can I best prepare him for the contest that I definitely want to fleece the other person on? How do I do that?
So other than put him up with the submissive.
Gosh, well, that's a level of cheating I'm not really ready to go for yet, right? I want to know how do I give myself the best probability of winning, of my hamster winning? What does my hamster need to experience? Testosterone's a great one.
Winning. So put him up with the
So I'm going to give him a win, and I'm going to give him.
testosterone.
And so what then would be my probability of him winning the next encounter? Well, it's on the board here. So the percentage that my resident hamster is going to win his next encounter. Yeah. So how do I bias the interaction? Before he goes for the gambling test, what does he have to experience? A win and testosterone. Right? So if I just give him testosterone, how does it work out for me? How often am I going to win if I just give him testosterone? It'd be I'd say 55%, right? It's like the, house edge in a Vegas casino maybe. Like not great odds, but, better, right, than that. But if I really want to make sure that I win, I give him a win. Maybe I choose a particularly submissive hamster, right? Get him warmed up, throw in some androgens, and the probability of winning goes to almost what? 100%. That hamster is going to win. Now, the question is, why? What is it about the behavior of our champion hamster that gives him, like what leads to him winning? Well, no, I'm asking what behaviors help him win. He's quicker to attack. And I'm not asking you to speculate, I'm asking you, right?
He does room time.
So if I just take a hamster, right now here's the thing. If I just take a hamster, I take him out of his cage, I give him a little saline injection, I put him back in, right? And I throw another male in his cage, how much attacking is he gonna do? Like how much in, let's say this is 10 minutes. You're gonna make about 5 attacks, kind of half-hearted in my opinion. Right? How long is he gonna wait to attack? 300 seconds, right? So that's what, like 5 minutes? Yeah, I'm not feeling good about that bet. What about our win plus testosterone hamster? How much is he attacking? About 35 attacks. How long is he waiting? Pretty much as soon as that hamster hits the chips, he's on. Alright? So, notice that we have really 2 things going on here. Right? We have a change in hormones and a change in experience. Right? The previous win is actually very critical to this. Right? Just giving testosterone or just giving a win is not enough. Right? To have both, we can get to, again, essentially, imagine you're the intruder hamster. If you've got a saline hamster or a control hamster in there, you maybe got about 5 minutes to warm up, stretch out a little bit, see how it's gonna go before you get attacked. Whereas as soon as we drop the other hamster in there, our attack hamster is on top of them, right? Attacking at 35 attacks in 10 minutes sounds like a lot of a hamster attack. I mean, it sounds like a hamster mauling, really. But you get the idea, right? That winning and losing, right, is very critical. And so the more wins you have, the higher the androgens will go, and the higher your status will go. Yes?
So how do you give them a win?
How do you give them a win? I think I'd take the classic sort of boxing approach, which is you put them in there against like a can, someone that they're gonna beat, right?
A can?
Like that, like in boxing, you like when you have you're not a fan of boxing sport. Well, so you know how like when a young fighter goes in there, they don't put him up against a really tough opponent at first. They put him in there against someone that they're gonna beat, and why do they do that? To get their confidence up. Right? Is that going to have an effect on their hormones?
Yes.
Are they going to be more likely to win the next fight if they won their fight at first?
Yes.
Yes. Right? And so that's how I would do it.
So how would a can?
Maybe a smaller hamster, maybe one that's used to losing, maybe one that's lost a few encounters. Right? No?
I'm not got that. That's what I was thinking initially, but then you said a can. How would it know?
They call that's what they call like a boxer. Yeah. No, they call. You guys are not boxing fans, clearly. That's okay. I'm just saying, you put them in against a lesser opponent.
Okay, there we go.
Right? A smaller hamster, a hamster that's taken a lot of losses. Right? Well, so there's so not to get into the hamster thing like too much, but so if a hamster takes enough losses, so there's a way, so there's a term called learned helplessness, right? It's a model for depression, where the animal just doesn't even want to like get up and eat, and it's a very powerful model of depression. And the way that you achieve learned helplessness in a hamster is you just run them through a bunch of really mean hamsters, and its continued losses at some point it's depressed. So you can put one of those hamsters in there and for sure get the win, right?
So
Sounds like college test.
no, it says so me.
So mean?
Yeah.
Well,
For
Yeah.
science, for the sake of science.
it's hard to understand. I mean, so depression is a very difficult phenotype, and not we're gonna like not to go on too far of an aside to this. It's difficult to get animals to be depressed, right? So you can either have animals that like baboons, for example, and we'll talk about them when we talk about stress, which I think is our next section. So baboons will harass each other, and the harassed baboons, like in the natural environment, those are a kind of a model for depression. But if you're going to do it in animals, right, it's difficult, right? It's difficult to make a depressed rodent, right? They just don't typically get depressed, right? And so in order to study, because again, it's an animal model because we're trying to model a mechanistic process which we're going to attempt to intervene and essentially alleviate. So if you can't make a depressed hamster, then you can't study depression in hamsters, right? And so conceivably, the idea is you want to make your hamster not depressed anymore by giving them drugs or something. But if you, for example, the easiest way to make an animal really depressed is to just eliminate all their dopamine neurons, right? But then it becomes very difficult for them to recover as well because, again, nothing ever feels good, right? It's called akidonia. And yes, it's not the greatest experiment to be a part of if you're a hamster. I mean, I guess you'd much rather be in the T versus win group and you're just running through hamsters as they're thrown into you. But somebody has to be the depressed hamster.
So would it eventually just die?
What? Do depressed people just die?
True.
I mean,
That's
you just
true.
said it sounds.
You know, the whole older couples, like the broken heart thing, older couples, like the broken heart thing, they die after their each
So
other.
yeah, so this is an interesting one. Do they die of a broken heart?
Sure.
So heard that gerbils die of a broken heart.
Why not?
So even humans, so the phenomenon that you're talking about is when you have a long-term, since we'll connect it to some stuff we've been talking about, we have long-term pair bonds, right? And then one spouse dies. The other spouse is has a much higher probability of dying within the next 12 months. But there's a sex difference there, right? So if the wife dies first, I mean the husband essentially is on a clock at that point.
Yeah.
But if the husband dies first, it's not the effect is not as strong. She's like, finally. Yeah. But so what kills them is not. So notice that you've taken away all the oxytocin. You have essentially put them in a very. Not only have you lowered all of their hormones, you've also massively increased cortisol. Right? And we'll be talking about that next time. And that increasing and high elevated cortisol for long periods of time is a great thing to lead to metabolic dysfunction, and if you're that old as well, it's probably not going to be great, as well as cardiovascular disease, inflammation, right, all sorts of downstream, so your sort of all-cause mortality goes up quite dramatically. But typically, now not to make light of it, but typically the problem is, yes, if a hamster, they can't continue to be in the experiments after they've gotten this sort of learned helplessness phenotype. I mean, you just can't keep using. Ayakuk would also not be happy that you're just using this one hamster that just, it loses all the time. But it will not just die, right? But it'll lose weight, right? It does all the classic depressed stuff. It loses weight, right? It becomes less active, right? That's why it's a kind of a great model, right? And then you can try to encourage it to get on the treadmill or the little wheel thingy, and it just isn't into it, right? It just kind of wants to sit on the side, right, and just waste away. But you do have to intervene for those animals. Okay. Depressed hamsters. Can we leave the depressed hamsters behind for a moment? All right. So. This is one of these things that, as behavioral endocrinologists, you just need to know, right? This is called the challenge hypothesis. It's one of the kind of seminal ideas in the field, and it it's related, or the issue is the relationship between aggression and androgens. Now, when I talked about the winner and loser effect, let's say two hamsters fight to a draw. How does the experimenter know that a draw has occurred? Nobody submits. Now, here's the interesting thing. Both fought, let's say vigorously, right? But it's a draw. No one wins. Does anyone get a boost in androgens?
Both.
No. Does anyone get a decrease in androgens?
No.
No, as long as they've not been injured, no. So the idea here is conflict resolution is what changes the hormones, not how hard they fought, right? And so there's been lots of work where they interrupt contests that are unsettled, and there is no winner and loser effect, right?
Okay, so that's what I was gonna ask, because you said neither submit, so they have to just end up pulling apart?
Yes,
Because-
exactly, right? Or another way that they've done this is they'll put a partition in between, and then you'll see the fish. Often, this was an experiment in fish where they kept at it, and they were interested in, right, whether or not you would get increases in cortisol or increases in androgen as a result of how hard you fought. Right, the idea being that, like, maybe if you fought really hard for a long time, let's say you were allowed to interact with this individual for 10 minutes versus 30 seconds, one might think that if you're fighting for 10 minutes, your androgens and your cortisol would go up, right? Or if you were for 30 seconds, maybe not. But the interesting part is that a unresolved contest leads to no changes in hormones, right? So again, this is kind of an important idea because the relationship between aggression and androgens and winner effects and loser effects is not exactly straightforward. Okay, so the challenge hypothesis, first described in birds and the house sparrows, is essentially that androgen elevation occurs only during a social challenge. This is different than the winner and loser effect. Now, if you're a house sparrow, what does that look like? What do these contests look like?
Sing?
Lots of singing, and then maybe some flying over and pecking. And you guys have backyards. You can watch the cardinals. They do this right now. If you've got trees in your backyard, you can probably see birds, cardinals and other birds, like fighting it out. They'll sing at each other and then they'll fly over, make sure the other one understands, hey, this is my territory. Right? This is what's going on. Now, this right now, temporally, is the breeding season. So our birds have high levels of androgens here. Now, a social challenge it comes in a couple of forms. One is a caged intruder, right? So basically, notice that in the cage, the bird can't flee. So you just put a bird in another male's territory, that male is going to be really upset. And he's going to respond by increasing both aggression and androgens. And so what's really interesting about this effect is that you have a rapid increase in androgens that are not mediated by LH. So there's some kind of store of androgens which are essentially released during a social challenge. Now, notice that you're eventually going to catch up with the LH surge, and you're going to get even higher levels of androgens, but the initial release of androgens is not really dependent on LH. All right, so this is a red-winged blackbird, as you can probably figure out why it's called that. So essentially what we're going to do is to take a dummy male, right, like a taxidermied male blackbird, and we're going to put them in the male's territory, and we're going to notice that he's singing, right? So the resident male is going to start singing much more vigorously. His rate of singing is going to increase dramatically, and he's going to start making these aggressive displays, right? That's an aggressive display from a red-winged blackbird. Now, or essentially, basically, this is going to continue to escalate because what is the dummy doing?
Nothing.
Not submitting. That's the important thing. Because remember, aggression doesn't end until submission. Right? So our red-winged blackbird is going to go over there and attack the dummy, and it turns out that these birds, the ones that are captured in the sort of moments of attack, have much more variation in their testosterone. Typically, you have an increase in testosterone in these birds. Okay.
Why doesn't he see the lack of singing as a submission?
Well, sometimes you can actually get the dummies. It depends. You can make so a lot of times they'll put a speaker with the other bird
It
too.
did say that. Yeah.
So they will, so that they'll get singing. In species that have to sing,
Yeah.
right, they'll get, yes. And they also have to leave, right? Notice that if you put a cardinal on a tree, that cardinal has to leave the tree before the encounter is over. Yes. Yeah, so most of the time, these are going to be like taxidermy birds, so that they're very realistic. Sometimes if you do this in fish, right, sometimes you don't need them to be that realistic, but often for birds they need to be pretty realistic and to sing the right song too. Okay, so if we sort of think about the way that this works, when is this going to be important? First off, in the breeding season, early, mid, late. When is this going to be most important? Early, right? That's because early is the time when status and territories are established. So this effect needs to be early. And what's the relationship between testosterone and prolactin in birds? It switches, right? So we have testosterone during the territory establishment, during the aggressive phase, during the courtship phase, and then once we have eggs and chicks, androgens are going to go down. Are we going to see the challenge hypothesis? Are we going to see challenge, again, social challenge met with androgens? Are we going to see that late in the breeding season? Not as much, right? It's going to be, this is a front-loaded phenomenon. Now, androgen elevation is associated with is temporally associated during times of territory establishment. Right? I think we don't need to belabor this, but essentially the idea is that when another male, so if a chickadee male comes to a cardinal male's tree, is he going to respond the same way? No, right? Because the chickadee male is not a threat to his social status. Right? If a female comes, is he going to respond aggressively to her? No, he's only going to respond this way to males. Now there's a couple of quick things that I want to cover here. So first off, this only happens in the beginning of the breeding season. And so notice that essentially we're going to go from our sort of normal level to what is called, well, got another marker here. So this would be what we'll call breeding baseline. So notice that as the breeding season begins, independent of any social interaction, androgens go up, right? This is how we know we're in the breeding season, and this is often called breeding baseline, right? Now, what happens here is that if this is in the beginning of the breeding season and there's challenges, you can get this. But later challenges, right, we're going to stay in the sort of breeding zone. Later challenges are not going to be met with androgens. Okay? And so early in the cycle, you can get large amounts of androgens as a result of being challenged. But you have to get above this sort of baseline level, right? This breeding baseline. And then you can, through social interactions, get your androgens much, much higher. And so, again, the challenge hypothesis predicts that androgens will only go up when there is a social challenge in the breeding season, and particularly in the early phase of the breeding season when territories and status are established. Yes?
So which line is the baseline?
So the baseline, so you have to be in between level A and B for this effect to occur.
Okay.
If you're below the level A, then you will not respond with androgens.
Does that mean you're not even in the breeding season?
Yes. Right? Or you have low androgen, like, so you could be in the parenting phase, you could be, you're not, so typically when we talk about breeding season, that incorporates like going from courtship to nest building to egg laying and then parenting, and then you're out of the breeding season. But here we're constraining it really to just the beginning courtship phase of the breeding season. So when you're back down over here, right, so, and again, I'm making a temporal statement rather than a quantifying the androgen level statement. So the levels of androgen here, I mean, obviously, they didn't do us a favor on this graph by making 0.1 go all the way, but you could imagine that here is where your regular androgens would go. Well, now there's a challenge here, we're gonna spike up above the sort of B level. But notice that after we've done this a few times, we're not going to get above that, right, again. And so that's why we call it, that's why it's facultative, right? So it's conditional to be above that. Between A and B is your breeding, your basic breeding level. Now, depending on the type of breeding, right? So depending on the, when these cycles occur, you can imagine, and this is what we're measuring here is relative testosterone during, and so the black bars on the x-axis are when the sort of courtship and sexual behavior occurs. And so there is a very tight correlation to responding to aggression with androgens during those phases, but not others, right? And if you have multiple of those phases, like in the song sparrow up top, they do it multiple times in a season, then you can get multiple increases in androgen resulting from challenge. Because again, if we didn't challenge our birds, we would not have an androgen profile that looked like this. Challenge, if they breed multiple times, this is just another way to kind of look at the same kind of thing, right? Notice that if you have 3 broods in a season during this high phase, right, during the sexual component, you're going to have lots of LH and testosterone. Parental, notice there's an inverse relationship. Sexual, parental, right? So the response to social challenge and the androgen response to social challenge occurs only during a restricted phase of the breeding season. Okay? All right. Humans, always difficult. Never easy. Well, we've got a couple slides left. Winning teams, this is the thing, winning teams tend to show elevated testosterone relative to losing teams. If you win the lottery, did you win anything? Yeah, well, you certainly did win something, but it's random, right? So you have to have some kind of perceived, let's say,
It's like a skill.
You have to have contributed, I guess. Yeah, like you have to have at least the. I don't want to say control. I want to say the perception of control, right? Because we always have to go back to, okay, the fans of the team, right? They felt like they won, even though they weren't actually competing, right? So it's really the perception, right? Because how do you refer to your team? How would you describe your team, how they did this weekend? Us. We got them good this time, you know? Like, did we really? Okay, so again, that's why on their fans rooting for the winning team often get a boost. But if you're not really a big fan, you're not going to get the boost. You don't refer to your team as our. We've got to go on the road this week to play. It's like, all right, okay, great. So there is, and so some of the data, and so this is from women. I'm going to show you 2 slides, and then we're going to kind of end this and kind of do our review. So this is, again, this is female prisoners. And so, and we're measuring salivary testosterone, and we're looking at we're looking at female prisoners in 2 contexts, whether they were a violent or non-violent criminal, and whether or not they were a rule violator in prison. And so notice that in both cases you see a small increase, right, in testosterone in the, essentially, I think violent crime is definitely rule violating outside of prison. That violent criminals have slightly higher androgens. It's not a huge effect, but certainly rule breaking, you have higher androgens. And so again, androgens are typically associated with risk-taking behavior in general. And that's often why the leading cause of death of young males is either other young males or misadventure, right? And so that is, it's reflected as well in women a little bit, not as strong an effect. Now this is an interesting one. This is testosterone by occupation, okay? Testosterone in males by occupation. So who has the highest testosterone levels? I don't think that's a surprise, right? And I don't think the lowest group, right, ministers, I don't think that's particularly a surprise. If you had to guess and say, all right, that tracks with what I would expect, right? What is if there's a surprising group on here?
Physician.
What to say? Okay, well, all right. So why are physicians so high?
The challenge.
They're stressed out.
This isn't cortisol. This is testosterone.
It's a challenge.
So-
Finding,
Yeah, the rush.
The rush?
I could say like treating people
Saving people.
as a win.
Firemen are so low.
Okay, so
No, I feel like surgery maybe is more than firemen because brain surgeons, one cut and they're dead.
It's just
well,
harder
I
to
think
do.
it's definitely. Well, I mean, I don't know. Running into a burning building or doing like surgery. I think both of those are both high stress positions. But again, I want to emphasize we're not looking at stress, right? We're not looking at stress. We're looking at androgen. So what we're trying to do here is sort of think about what could be reflective of this. So if it was just physical activity, who would be the highest? Who would be the second highest?
Fireman.
Firemen. I would argue firemen, right? Even though their job I still think their job is pretty stressful, I would guess. But it's probably not as, it's a very physical job, right? So we've got professors and physicians, and I can tell you from the perspective of one of those, it's not a very physical job. Faculty meetings are kind of crazy, but so what is this reflective of? So someone said it. Status.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
So for professors, is it?
Are you gonna make me feel bad?
No,
No, go ahead.
For
No,
professors,
go
would it
ahead.
be like status in the classroom that boosts the testosterone or status among
Authoritative most of the
Peers,
time.
like maybe coworkers.
Is professor a high status profession?
Yes.
To the
I'd say it's
Yes.
reasonably, right? It's a white collar profession, right? I mean, it's, we've got, salesmen, right? So there's lots of different kinds of sales. Some are, so the interesting part is, if you ranked this by, just income, I think salesmen would probably be much higher, oftentimes than some of these other categories, certainly than professor. Right? But typically, salesman is not a particularly prestigious job, right? Physician is if someone says, hey, you're a doctor, wow, okay, that's a high, they have an immediate appraisal of status as a result of being a physician. But if, I don't know, if we said, oh, we're gonna have a guest speaker today, it's going to be a physician. I'm sure lots of you would be very excited. It's kind of a audience that would be that. But if I said, oh, like Tom Brady is coming in to talk about this too, you'd be like, wow, really? Tom Brady? That's amazing. Like, how did you get him to come in here and talk about behavioral endocrinology? Big fan, Tom Brady, turns out. So I think the idea here is that it's not perfect, right? But this is a representation of social status, generally speaking, right? And I think the big piece is that these are very physical positions. This one is held in as much higher social status, right, than the other groups. Yes?
Where do you think lawyers on here? And it's been positioned as a fellow professor. I feel like that's pretty high status.
So I don't know, some people have a really dim view of lawyers, right? So I think you're gonna find a lot of bifurcation. Some people think very low, like it's like asking about politicians too, right? So some people have like a high opinion of politicians, other people have low opinion of politicians. I mean, it's so think about lawyer, right? So a lawyer can be like, I don't like lawyer, you can have negative opinions of lawyers, but who has negative opinions of physicians? Like,
Yeah, because you really only call them when you're trying to.
and so lawyers actually have I would say, I mean, nothing against the law profession, but I think that status varies greatly. If you say, oh, that guy's a lawyer, like, okay, like what kind of lawyer, like, what kind of, you say what kind of lawyer, like what, and so I think status amongst the law profession varies more wildly. Saying that someone's a lawyer, right, is not necessarily, I think, the same level of status. But not that it's bad or whatever. I mean, these are generalizations. They probably pick professors because they were an easy group to get a hold of if you're doing this at an academic institution. And they probably, who knows, they may even have bumped their own grades up. Well, I mean, professor is obviously the highest status. I'm surprised it's not above NFL players. All right, so that's all I have for this. So, do we have any figures? Let's try to focus on figures for either social behavior, or we can do some aggression ones again. But are there any figures that? And again, I recommend going to these figures, and I've been making this recommendation a few times, which is just have the blank figure in front of you and write down how you would explain it, right? Because it's going to do two things, I think, which are important, or depending. So some people are really fast test takers, and other people are slower test takers, but everybody is faster if they know what they're going to say ahead of time, right? So, and I think that can be a much easier process, because again, I'm not, again, as I told you, I'm not trying to trick you.
Can we do that? Will you look at it for us?
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to, Well, we did pretty good as a group. I was surprised we were rated that high. I've seen some of the professors around here. Yeah.
For the sparrows with the colored feathers.
Yeah,
So
the Harris sparrows.
the Harris sparrows, the color, is it determined
No, okay, so the color is not determined at puberty. The color, so if you know much about birds, right? So birds molt their feathers periodically, like they shed all of their feathers and then they grow them back. And so migratory birds will typically do this like before the next migration. So essentially what happens is that all the birds establish their social status in a group, right? And then when they molt for the journey south, then they darken up, right, relative to the status that they were. Because so it's not, so each year they have to reestablish their status in their local group.
And it's not connected to testosterone.
It's connected to the testosterone during the breeding season.
Oh, so like, so since they had higher testosterone, it was like a byproduct.
Yeah, so notice, so here's the thing. So, like, we'll just have this. So we're a Harris sparrow. We have this boost in androgen. We parent. Our chicks grow up. Our winter molt happens, and then we fly. That's androgen. Then we fly, and this is in our winter feeding. So the androgens we had and the status that we established occurred way over here. Then we raised some kids, then we molted, and then we flew south, and this is where the action is actually happening. So there's no androgens here, but it is related to androgens. So the status that you have in your local group, right, is related to the androgen. So alphas have more androgen than betas or gammas, right? So
Do the groups travel together?
they fly south, but they don't associate. So it's like a huge, like I said, there's like thousands of birds at these wintering grounds. So they don't like stick together as far as I know.
So the color doesn't kick in until the next breeding season?
No, so here's where this, I'm gonna draw a bird just because it's gonna be terrible.
Better than my
Can you
birds.
draw?
Awesome.
Okay, so this, I feel like you're right, it does need some tail feathers. Tail feathers have to be purple.
There we go.
That looks like a tail.
There we go.
There we go. All right, that's a reasonable tail feather. So here is where they get this. This is where they turn black. Okay? And so then they fly south, and then, again, notice that as a general rule, having the color allows you to have a hierarchy without having to fight it out and remember everybody. So the odds are that, like, if you're like a basketball team, like there's the 5 of you right there, you could be like a basketball team. Yeah, you could. And so one of you is going to be the best player on the team. Okay. So if you're the best player, and like you guys are 5 basketball team, one of you guys are going to be the best player. The best ones of both of those are going to be the darkest, and then the second darkest, and third darkest. And so when you go and play in the mixed group, everybody who's wearing like the black shirt goes to like court 1 with all the other top players, and then if you're the lightest bird, you go down and you're trying to get the get a pickup game at the lowest table, right?
And it starts over at the breeding season.
And then it starts over at the breeding season. Every year, you essentially now you're going back, and maybe you were the blackest bird last time, and now there's a new bird that's even bigger and stronger and more aggressive than you, and you might be pushed down to beta. But again, you know what your status is in your relative group, and that's reflected. So now maybe year 2, you've still got some dark, but you're not as dark as you were before.
Okay, so then how does he come back after that?
How does he come back?
Yeah, like once he's lost, right? He was dominant, then he lost, and then now remember he's gonna be light feather when he goes back north during the summer, and then,
Well, so so here, right? So they're gonna go, and then they're gonna do their, let's say their summer molt.
oh, so it's 2 molds.
Yeah.
Oh,
And then they're gonna migrate north. They're gonna do this whole thing,
mhm.
and then again.
So what happens in the summer mold with the feathers?
So they're gonna be back to, they're all gonna kind of be the same color again.
Oh, okay, okay.
Right, because again, notice that they're gonna go back there and they have to establish their rank.
Mhm.
Right? Every time you go to a new group, right? So it's like if you went to play on their basketball team all of a sudden, since you're like the Michael Jordan of our little group here, you're gonna go over here, and then let's say you were the dominant one, now you're gonna be beta, because now Michael Jordan joined your basketball team, and that's just tough, right?
And that's
So
to
that's-
reduce conflict during the winter.
Yes, exactly. This whole color pattern is not to establish their status here, because notice that like you all 5 know each other.
Mhm.
And you will sort out your dominance hierarchy, and it'll be very serious to you. Who's the number one, because this has breeding consequence, right? The best one of you gets the best net, or the best nest site, and all of this. So you're gonna fight this out on the local level, but this can get very contentious when there's 1,000 birds and no way to tell them apart. So you can massively reduce aggression by having now is this perfect? Like, no, right? So maybe your basketball team is like, I don't know, like you're like the Golden State Warriors and you're like GSU's basketball team. Now granted, but like everyone on that team is better than the best person on this team, right? And that is going to be reflected, right? So they're going to have all of their statuses, right, be reflected in their codes, and same thing for you, even though they all might be bigger and more dominant, but there's no way to sort of know that. So it's like a rule of thumb. The darker the bird, the more dominant they are. That reduces aggression sufficiently in this environment.
So
Yes.
it reduces aggression and increases reproductive success.
Yeah, because you're not fighting all the time, right? So what you really don't want to have happen is fighting all the time, which means you're not going to be getting food, you're going to be taking damage and injury, right? So what you want to do, now granted, here's the thing, you want to come down here, eat as much as you can, come back, and get the best breeding situation, do it again. Good.
So how much testosterone you had like during the breeding season, the way that like alpha males like usually have more testosterone,
Yeah.
that determines how dark the coat
Yeah,
becomes.
Yes.
So it was your status from the prior breeding season.
yes.
Based on testosterone levels.
So alphas have more testosterone than betas, and so yes, so status is androgen, I wouldn't say it's androgen dependent, but it's certainly androgen related,
Okay.
right?
So with that, in the winter moon, like you said, there could have been one that was much darker, but then one may come back. How does that happen if this one was already dark? They would be eating a lot more during the winter feeding, so when it comes back around, it wouldn't like stay the same?
So I think if you're asking how does the status in the local group change, right, as a result of winter feeding, and doesn't it end up staying stratified? Why wouldn't it end up staying stratified? Like if you were alpha year like 2015, why wouldn't you be alpha in 2016 when you did it again? Now I think the answer to that question is that if it's just the same individuals that you all go back to the same breeding season again, it's probably you're going like, so in most hierarchies, let me just take a step back for a hierarchy. In most hierarchies, alpha is one of the most stable positions. So the odds are if you're alpha 1 year and you go back and everybody else is the same, all the same birds are there, the probability that you're going to be alpha again is quite high, right? But the lower you get on the hierarchy, the more churn there is, right? So if instead of being alpha, like beta and gamma might switch, right? Maybe beta just had some good luck and got some more food. Remember, you got thousands of birds, right? So you're not kind of with your group anymore. Maybe, you were, you had some experience which allowed you to grow faster or whatever. Maybe you were a younger bird last year and you were submitting to the older birds, the older males, but now you're as big as they are and maybe you're a better fighter. So you're gonna get churn in any hierarchy, but when the identities stay the same, then typically you're not getting a lot of movement, right? So if it's like you got 10 birds, all 10 of you go down to the wintering flock, and then all 10 of you went back and did the thing for the breeding season, then yeah, you probably wouldn't change much status, but I'd be surprised if there was no switching at all. These animals, remember, animals are always wanting, animals are always testing the higher level. Right? That's kind of where the whole idea comes from with hierarchies, is that like the more stable the hierarchy, the less mobility there is, the more unstable, the more shifting between levels there is. That's a sort of a general rule of hierarchies, and the less stable, meaning the more people are switching levels, the higher everyone's cortisol is. Right? So if you have a very rigid hierarchy, everyone knows their place, everybody's cortisol is relatively low. Even the lowest people, because even the lowest individuals, not saying people, but the lowest individuals they understand their role and they are not fighting, so they know what to expect. And so if the hierarchy is stable there, everybody has low cortisol. Any social behavior questions? Yes?
I thought there was a figure that was like, I don't remember of it, but it was like, people are showed pictures of their partner and then like attractiveness
Oh, yeah.
partners with and without oxytocin.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's like the complicated one for like lots of panels.
Sorry to go this way, right? This one or this one? They're both gonna say the same thing. This is in females and this is in males. This one has a little bit more mechanism attached to it.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. So first off, HC is hormonal birth control. Okay, so normally cycling women on hormonal birth control. Now, these arousal and attractiveness, these are self-report numbers, right? So, take that for, the sort of standard human caveat. But they're essentially very similar to each other, right? You see for arousal, the only real effect that we see is the difference between partner in the presence of oxytocin or not, right? And so you get a significant difference here in attractiveness, and there's a trend, right? This is not significant, but it's probably like 0.15 or something. So it's similar, and it's in the same general direction, okay? So a couple of important takeaways here is that this number is not different, right? First critical comparison thing is that this isn't different. So why is that a critical comparison? Because it tells us that the oxytocin effect is specific to the pair bonded partner, right? It's not that everyone's more attractive, it's that just your partner is more attractive, okay? That's, right? These two are important, right? I think for obvious reasons. These are important for kind of obvious reasons, I think, which we just talked about, right? So it's not a universal effect. And this is very interesting, right? And I'm referring to the partner oxytocin in the normally cycling women versus the women on hormonal birth control.
They were given oxytocin.
Yes, they were given oxytocin. So, what does this tell us? We have to unpack. This is the tougher conclusion because it requires us to kind of incorporate lots of pieces of information that we know now. So what does that tell us? What does this difference tell us?
That estrogen oxytocin effect is dependent on
We can do better than that. Yes, it's not on a normal cycle, but what does hormonal birth control, what does a woman on hormonal birth control not have? Estrogen. So rephrase.
So the oxytocin effect can only happen if there is estrogen.
So the oxytocin effect is estrogen dependent. Right? So I mean, it's not like I would take points off for the way that you were phrasing it, but I'm just trying to move towards like, what we can say is that the oxytocin effect of increased partner attraction and arousal is estrogen dependent. Or dependent on estrogen, right? You have to have estrogen.
What's the familiar OST for?
So this one, this is, you're looking at a picture of, in this case, because these are women, right? This is a familiar male that you are, so it's a familiar male that you're given oxytocin, right? So this allows us to say that the oxytocin effect is specific to your partner, right? And that it's estrogen dependent, right? This comparison says estrogen dependent. This comparison says it's for your partner only. So there's a lot here. It's not, like I said, if I had gotten to review this paper, I would change all their abbreviations because they're almost nonsensical. Like it requires like a key.
Yeah.
So what is the question? Oh, you can help me out. What is the question here? What are we interested in? Okay, so we're interested in the effect of oxytocin on what?
Based on estrogen.
Between
The familiar.
normal
Hair
cycle.
We're sort of circling around it, right? So what do we want to know?
Is it something?
Does hormone affect the oxytocin effect?
Not quite. We're getting there, right? So
Is
what do we want to know?
increased?
So first off, what manipulation are we doing?
Oxytocin.
What are we measuring? Okay, attractiveness and arousal. So first off, what are we interested in? Whether or not oxytocin affects attractiveness and arousal of your partner versus not, and whether that effect is estrogen dependent. Yeah, I know. We took pieces of everybody's answer, we cobbled it together into right? But so another way to sort of think about, right, how, what's this about? Well, what are we doing? Well, we're giving oxytocin, so we've got to be interested in the effect of oxytocin on something, because we're giving oxytocin or not. So we're interested in the effect of oxytocin. What are we measuring? Arousal and attractiveness, okay? We're measuring the effect of oxytocin on arousal and attractiveness between partners and familiar males, right? And kind of a secondary piece is that we're interested in whether or not that effect, the effect of oxytocin, is mediated by estrogen. Because if it was mediated by progesterone, would we see it in hormonal birth control women? Yes, we would. If the effect was progesterone, right, dependent, we would see it in women on hormonal birth control. Right? See how we can sort of extract bunches of information about the nature of the effect by comparing all of these things together. So notice we can say the effect is specific to the male, right? It's your pair bonded male, right? It is, right? It increases, oxytocin increases attractiveness significantly and a little trend towards arousal, but that it's also estrogen dependent. Good. This is a complicated figure, but there's a lot of, the reason that some of these complicated figures are worth it is they have really important kind of take-homes. So why is this important as a take-home thing? Why should we care about this?
For humans, right?
Yeah, so we've been,
The effects of birth control.
Well, so is it gonna make it easier or harder to pair bond on hormonal birth control? Harder. Right? Interesting. Yeah. Okay. All right, and the other, when you combine that with the fact that, it's like women have their preference, right, changes over the course of their ovarian cycle, for their preference for smells, their preference for facial type, right? So it's a woman on hormonal birth control is different in many important ways relative to pair bonding and attractiveness and mating than a normally cycling woman would be, right? And so, as I said, in biology, there's never a free lunch, right? There's always costs, right? There's cost to everything. Okay, well, you guys have a great weekend.
When do we get the exams back?
I'm hoping Tuesday. I was out of town last weekend, so I didn't get to really start on them after the exam. But I'll be working on them. I've started on them already. Because I'm hoping for Tuesday, but for sure by Thursday.
Thank you.
It says we have an activity to an iCollar on Tuesday.
Yep.
Pair bonding
I'm pair bonding. Yep.
You didn't say anything.
I said last time that I was going to post one, and I didn't post it, and I forgot to post it. So
Okay.
it's a short paper. It's a science paper. It's on pair bonding. It should be very easy to understand. It's an assignment. Yeah, so on iCollege you have to read a paper and answer some questions. Maybe I should post an announcement on that. Okay.